In 1912, Sergei Rachmaninoff, at the height of his career, found himself corresponding with a 23-year-old writer who seemed to understand him better than anyone else. Their letters would grow increasingly personal, with Rachmaninoff sharing his deepest insecurities.
"Teach me how to have faith in myself,"
he wrote to her. As their correspondence became more intimate, one can't help but wonder, was there more to their connection than meets the eye? At 39 years old, Sergei Rachmaninoff was basking in the glow of success. He was a definite favorite among Moscow's young music lovers, particularly the women, who treated him in a way reminiscent of the listomania of the previous century. They sought newspaper articles about him, mobbed him after concerts, and even had police called on them when they'd hide in his carriage. Any artist would feel on top of the world with this sort of treatment, but for Rachmaninoff, this wasn't the case. Despite his outward success, Rachmaninoff grappled with immense self-doubt as a composer. The harsh criticism of his first symphony years earlier had plunged him into a depression so severe that he required therapy to overcome it. And it was in this context that Marietta Shaginian entered his life. Shaginian, a young Armenian-Russian writer, had already made a name for herself in Moscow's literary circles by the time she initiated contact with Rachmaninoff. At just 23, her literary knowledge, cultural acumen, and keen intellect positioned her as a rising star among the city's intelligentsia. This background would soon prove invaluable in the events to come, but for now, her main objective was to make contact with the man she'd long admired. It's not at all far-fetched to say that she was infatuated with him, as many of the young, music-loving ladies were. It's very likely that this feeling is what ultimately compelled her to reach out.
"I wrote a letter to Sergei Rachmaninoff, whom I did not know at the time,"
she later recalled.
"I sent my letter to catch him in St. Petersburg, where he had gone for a concert, and I signed it Re to conceal my true name."
During that time, it was not at all unusual for strangers to write to their idols.
Complete strangers wrote letters to each other, and a great deal of spiritual strength was spent that way.
But what was a bit more unexpected was actually receiving a reply. To her surprise, Rachmaninoff would soon write back.
"My dear Re, thank you for your charming letter, which I received yesterday,"
he wrote, taking another step towards a correspondence that was to have a bigger impact than he ever could have imagined. From the start, his words held a surprising degree of openness and warmth.
"What is the matter with you? Are you ill? Why do your letters leave such a sad impression?"
Unfortunately, none of Shaginian's replies to the composer survive. But from his responses, one can glean that he was very much impressed by her intellect. In a subsequent letter, he asks,
"My dear Re, you are not going to be angry with me if I ask you to do me a favor? I need texts for my songs. Could you suggest something? I imagine that Re knows a great deal in this field. She knows almost everything, or perhaps even everything."
And thus, their early correspondence was centered primarily on musical and literary matters. Shaginian would later recall,
"Our correspondence immediately became a sort of intercourse between musician and writer. He asked me to help him, and I often copied, prepared, and arranged verses, poems, and texts of Russian poets for him."
She was also bold enough to give the composer advice on matters within his own expertise.
"Sometimes I became impertinent enough to make suggestions to Rachmaninoff regarding his music. What I would have done were I in his place. Rachmaninoff followed my advice."
While most composers would have been quick to take offense, the humble Rachmaninoff readily welcomed the input of his young literary admirer. He acknowledged her critiques and suggestions regarding his compositions and often implemented them. When she chided him for supposedly seeking cheap theatrical success, Rachmaninoff playfully responded,
"Do you think it was necessary to say this to me, my dear Re?"
It would appear that their relationship had evolved from a simple fan-artist dynamic to more of an intellectual partnership. Soon, it would evolve even further. Shaginian, perhaps emboldened by her idol's willingness to be open, began to inquire about Rachmaninoff's personal life. But from his responses, one can see that the composer proceeded cautiously, writing,
I write so little about myself because I hardly know you, my dear Re.
He responded to her probing questions tactfully, ensuring that personal boundaries remained firmly in place.
You ask me what I love beside my children, music and flowers. Anything you like, my dear Re, even crab soup.
But in time, their inhibitions began to fade. As their correspondence continued, and their letters became longer and longer, both parties began to venture into more personal territories. Shaginian began seeking more info about his domestic life. She even inquired about the kinds of women he found appealing. Rachmaninoff, in turn, opened up even more.
Besides my children, music and flowers, I also love you, my dear Re, and your letters. I love you because you are clever, interesting, and you do not go to extremes. This is one of the most important conditions for anyone to be attractive to me. And I love your letters because I find in them your faith, love, and hope in me, the balm with which I cure my wounds.
It is evident that Shaginian occupied a distinct place in Rachmaninoff's mind. Despite being a notoriously reserved figure, he found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. His responses became more detailed and revealing, touching upon aspects of his life that he rarely shared with others. Perhaps most notably, Rachmaninoff began to confide in Shaginian about his deep-seated insecurities. In a particularly vulnerable moment, he wrote,
Teach me to have faith in myself, my dear Re, perhaps half as much as you have in me.
This plea for reassurance and support reveals the extent to which Rachmaninoff had come to trust Shaginian. Her role had expanded from that of collaborator to that of confidant, a source of emotional support and validation. The composer's willingness to expose his vulnerabilities to her suggests a level of intimacy that would soon lay the groundwork for their first face-to-face meeting. At the end of 1912, after nearly 10 months of coquettish written communication, Rachmaninoff and Shaginian finally met in person, marking a pivotal moment in their relationship. Even though by this time Rachmaninoff had long since uncovered the true identity of Ray, the encounter still added new dimensions to their already complex dynamic. Apparently, the face-to-face encounter only seemed to deepen Rachmaninoff's affection for Shaginian. His subsequent letters expressed a profound gratitude and tenderness that bordered on the romantic. In one particularly poignant missive, he wrote of wanting to
see you at once, to hear you, to sit next to you, and to talk to you frankly and intimately, to talk to you, about myself, about anything you would like, or perhaps keep silent, but above all, to see you and sit next to you. Oh, where are you, my dear Re? And when will I see you?
Such expressions of affection and longing might easily be misconstrued as romantic interest. However, the true nature of their relationship was far more nuanced. Rachmaninoff had been married for a decade when he met Shaginian, and there is no concrete indication that he sought to alter this established domestic arrangement. His letters, which frequently referenced his wife and children, were consistently respectful, indicating his unwavering commitment to his family. For her part, Shaginian's intense emotional investment likely stemmed from her own background. Having lost her father at a young age, she may have viewed the composer as a paternal figure, explaining the emotional charge of their friendship and her occasional bouts of jealousy when other admirers sought the composer's attention. In the context of early 20th century artistic circles, such intense platonic relationships between artists and their muses were not uncommon. Their bond, while intense and at times ambiguous, ultimately served as a catalyst for creativity, inspiring some of Rachmaninoff's most poignant works. For instance, his set of 14 songs, Opus 34, were almost entirely based off of texts supplied by Shaginian. In fact, one of the compositions in this set, aptly titled The Muse, was dedicated to her. The songs of Opus 38 were also based on poems that she supplied. While hints of romantic undertones colored their exchanges, in reality, their bond appears to have been one of mutual respect, artistic inspiration, and deep emotional understanding. Shaginian later described their typical in-person meetings.
I very often sat next to him while he worked, because he would ask me to tell him stories.
Shaginian, it seems, occupied a unique space in Rachmaninoff's life, not as a romantic interest, but as a muse, a confidant, and a sympathetic ear. Their relationship, intense and emotionally charged as it was, ultimately remained within the bounds of a profound intellectual and artistic connection. The correspondence between Sergei Rachmaninoff and Marietta Shaginian would come to an abrupt end in 1917. Rachmaninoff, fearing the impending revolution, made the difficult decision to leave Russia indefinitely. He packed up his things and, along with his wife and daughters, fled to America, where he would spend the rest of his days. The two would never communicate again. The depths of Rachmaninoff's connection with Shaginian remained a well-guarded secret for decades after their correspondence ended. It wasn't until after the composer's death in 1943 that this intriguing chapter of his life came to light. In 1946, Shaginian, by then a celebrated and decorated writer, made the decision to publish a selection of Rachmaninoff's letters. This revelation caught many who knew the composer off guard, leaving them perplexed about the nature of Shaginian's relationship with him. The publication of these letters offered a rare glimpse into Rachmaninoff's inner world, revealing a more vulnerable side of the usually reserved composer. Those who had known him struggled to reconcile the man portrayed in these intimate exchanges with the stoic public persona they had come to know. Perhaps most significantly, the letters provided invaluable insight into the complex web of relationships that shaped Rachmaninoff's life and work, illuminating the profound impact that a young, passionate writer had on one of the 20th century's most influential composers.